Stop reading the ending into the silence. Not because the silence does not hurt, not because the distance is not real or the withdrawal did not happen, or the cooling was not felt in the specific cellular way that the withdrawal of genuine warmth is always felt by someone who is paying full attention. All of that is real. The silence is real, the distance is real, the particular absence of someone who was present in a way that mattered is as real as anything in the emotional landscape of a human life. But real does not mean final, and silence does not mean over. And the distance that the avoidant creates, the specific, fear-driven, self-protective distance that arrives precisely when the connection was becoming most genuine, is not the same as departure, is not the same as the decision to end, is not the same as the clean, conscious, deliberate conclusion of someone who has assessed the connection, found it wanting, and chosen to redirect their life in a direction that does not include the person they are now silent toward. It looks like that. On the surface, in the behavior, in the absence of contact and the presence of managed distance, and the particular cooling that follows genuine warmth, it looks like someone who has decided it is over and is living inside that decision. It is not that. In most cases, in the specific psychology of the avoidant who genuinely connected and then genuinely retreated, it is something considerably more complicated than a decision. It is a fear response, a nervous system event. The activation of an interior alarm that the conscious mind did not choose, and the behavior is now expressing in the only language the alarm knows: distance, silence. The managed retreat from something that was real enough to be frightening. Understanding the difference between a decision and a fear response is the beginning of reading this accurately. Because decisions and fear responses look identical from the outside. Both produce distance, both produce silence, both produce the behavioral absence of someone who was present and is now not. But they are entirely different interior events with entirely different implications for what the behavior actually means and what, if anything, it is likely to become. A decision is made from the evaluative part of the self, the part that weighs information, considers options, arrives at a conclusion about what serves the person's genuine interests, and acts from that conclusion. A decision to end a connection comes from the part of the person that has genuinely assessed the connection, its qualities, its costs, its fit with what the person actually needs and wants, and determined that the honest assessment does not support continued investment. That kind of decision has a different quality in the behavior it produces. It tends to be more consistent, more complete, less interrupted by the involuntary surfacing of genuine feeling that contradicts the behavioral withdrawal. Less characterized by the specific avoidant signature of the warmth returning in the unguarded moments before the management reasserts itself. Less likely to produce the particular tells, the peripheral presence, the continued engagement with things adjacent to the person, the specific quality of the silence that carries interior content rather than genuine absence, that genuine avoidant retreat characteristically produces. The avoidance distance is a fear response, and fear responses, unlike decisions, are not organized around the genuine assessment of the connection. They are organized around the protection of the self from the specific threat that the nervous system has identified. And the threat the avoidance nervous system identifies in genuine, deepening, reciprocally invested connection is not the person, it is the vulnerability, the exposure, the genuine stakes, the specific condition of having something real enough to lose. The avoidant who retreats from genuine connection is not retreating from the person. They are retreating from what caring about the person makes possible, the specific, terrifying, entirely legitimate possibility of being truly hurt by the loss of something they truly want. That is the threat the distance is responding to, and that threat is not eliminated by the distance. It simply becomes less immediate, less acutely present, more manageable in the reduced proximity conditions of the established distance. But the wanting does not go with it. The love does not go with it. The genuine feeling for the person, the real, specific, irreplaceable quality of what existed in the connection remains in the interior of the avoidant who retreated from it. Remains present, remains alive, remains the thing that the unguarded moments keep surfacing even when the behavior is organized around the suppression of its expression. They still love you. That is not a consolation constructed to make the distance more bearable. It is the accurate psychological description of what tends to be true in the interior of an avoidant who retreated from genuine connection. The love is not conditional on its expression. It does not require behavioral demonstration to continue existing. It exists in the interior, in the silence, in the staying away that is maintained not because the feeling is gone, but because the feeling is precisely what the distance is protecting against. This is the paradox at the center of avoidant retreat. The distance is maintained because the connection was real enough to be threatening. The silence is maintained because the wanting is real enough to be dangerous, to act on without the capacity to sustain what acting on it would require. The withdrawal happened because the feeling was genuine enough to produce the specific vulnerability that the avoidance nervous system treats as the most threatening available condition. The retreat is the evidence of the love, not the absence of it. The scale of the withdrawal reflects the scale of the genuine feeling that made the withdrawal feel necessary. An avoidant does not retreat from connection that does not matter. They retreat from connection that matters too much, that presses too genuinely against the defended interior, that creates too real a stake, that requires too genuine an exposure of the self that the architecture was built to protect. The silence is the measure of what was real, not the negation of it. They still want to be with you. This is the part that the behavior makes nearly impossible to believe. Because wanting, in ordinary relational logic, produces approach. Wanting produces the reaching toward, the maintaining of contact, the behavioral expression of the desire in the form of presence and engagement, and the showing up that wanting is supposed to naturally generate. The avoidance wanting does not always produce approach. In the conditions where the wanting is most acute, where the depth of the desire is most genuinely felt, where the specific quality of what was present in the connection is most clearly perceived, the wanting can produce exactly the opposite. Can produce the retreat that is, counterintuitively, the behavioral expression of desire in someone whose nervous system has learned to treat desire as the precondition for devastating loss. The avoidant wants to be with you in the specific, interior, genuinely felt way of someone who has experienced what being with you actually is and has not found anything in the subsequent distance that adequately substitutes for it. Not in the idealized way of someone who has rewritten the history of the connection into something more beautiful than it was. In the accurate, clear-eyed, I know exactly what this was, and I have not found its equivalent way of someone who is living in the absence of something genuinely significant and feeling that absence with the specific, textured, directional quality of real missing rather than generic loneliness. Generic loneliness does not have a name. What the avoidant is experiencing has a name. It has the specific shape of the person they retreated from, the particular quality of what that person brought. The irreplaceable texture of what it felt like to be in the connection before the fear got loud enough to produce the distance. That specificity is the wanting. That directed, named, specific orientation of the interior toward a particular person is not the experience of someone who has concluded it is over and moved on. It is the experience of someone who has not concluded anything with the finality that the behavior suggests, who is living in the unresolved territory of wanting something they do not trust themselves to have, without hurting it. Not over does not mean the same thing as going to be fine. That distinction matters and deserves to be held clearly alongside everything that is true about the love and the wanting and the retreat being a fear response rather than a decision. Because not over and going to be fine are not the same condition. Not over simply means the interior reality of the connection has not concluded. The feeling has not resolved. The wanting has not redirected. The love has not transferred to indifference. It is a statement about what is still present in the avoidance interior. Going to be fine requires something additional, something that is not guaranteed by the presence of the love or the realness of the wanting or even the genuine recognition, in the avoidance more honest interior moments, that what was retreated from was worth not retreating from. Going to be fine requires the avoidance genuine, sustained, internally motivated choice to do the work that closes the gap between the interior reality and the behavioral expression of it. The work that makes the wanting into showing up. That makes the love into presence. That makes the not over interior reality into the actually different behavioral reality that the connection would need to become. That work is not guaranteed by the feeling, has never been guaranteed by the feeling. The feeling has always been real. The gap between the feeling and the adequate expression of it has also always been real. And that gap does not close through the passage of time or the accumulation of regret, or even the genuine painful recognition of what the retreat cost the person who did not deserve to receive its impact. It closes through the work, through the genuine, sustained, supported, identity-touching interior work of the avoidant, who chooses, consciously, in the full awareness of what it costs and what it requires, to become someone whose love can be received by the people they give it to. The person who still wants to be with you, who still loves you in the silent and retreated way of someone whose fear got louder than their feeling in the moment of the withdrawal, that person is at a crossroads that only they can navigate. The crossroads between the wanting that stays interior and the wanting that becomes the motivation for genuine change. Between the love that lives in the silence and the love that develops the capacity to live in the open. Between the not over that remains perpetually suspended in the unresolved interior and the not over that becomes the beginning of something actually different, that navigation is entirely theirs. No one can do it for them. No quality of love from the outside, no patience of waiting, no generosity of understanding, no continued orientation toward the person who retreated. None of it determines which direction the navigation goes. Only the avoidant's own genuine choosing determines that. What belongs to the person who loves the avoidant, who is sitting with the silence and the distance, and the accurate knowledge that the interior reality of the connection has not concluded, that the love and the wanting are genuinely still present in someone whose behavior is not currently reflecting them, is a question that deserves genuine, honest, self-referencing engagement. Not the question of whether it is over. The interior answer to that is already known. It is not in the sense that matters psychologically fully over. The feeling is real and present on both sides, and the connection has not resolved into the clean closure that would make the grief straightforward. But the question of what the not over is worth, of what the love and the wanting, genuinely present in the avoidance interior, but currently unexpressed in any form that the person who loves them can actually receive and build on, are worth in the specific concrete. This is my actual life terms of what is being asked to continue and at what cost. Not over is real. And not over without demonstrated change, without the genuine behavioral shift that moves the interior reality into something the other person can actually experience, rather than simply infer. Not over is also not enough. The love that lives only in the silence is real love, and it is insufficient love, both simultaneously, without apology for the complexity of that. Both fully true. Real because the feeling is genuine, the wanting is specific and directional. The interior orientation toward the person is not the absence of feeling, but the suppressed presence of it. Insufficient because love that does not reach the person it is for, love that exists in the interior and does not find its way into the consistent, present, daily, chosen behavioral reality of genuinely showing up, is love that the person receiving it cannot actually receive, cannot build a life on, cannot use as the foundation for the genuine, mutual, reciprocal connection that the genuine feeling, if it ever found adequate expression, would make possible. The bridge between the real and the sufficient is not made of feeling, it is made of effort. Of the genuine, sustained, ordinary conditions effort that only the interior work can produce and only demonstrated behavior can confirm. Until that bridge is built, until the love that is real becomes the love that is also expressed in the form that makes it receivable, the not over is true, and the not enough is also true. And the person who loves the avoidant deserves to hold both of those truths with complete clarity. Not to use the not over as the reason to remain in insufficient conditions indefinitely. Not to dismiss the real love as meaningless, because its expression has been inadequate. But to see clearly. Both things, the real feeling and the insufficient expression, the genuine not over and the genuine not enough. And from that clarity, from the full, honest, non-narrative seeing of the complete picture, to make the choice that their actual life, in its actual conditions, genuinely deserves. Not the choice the love demands. Not the choice the hope suggests. The choice that the full, honest, both things true picture makes possible. That choice, made clearly, with everything known, is the only choice worth making. The choice made clearly, with everything known, is not a single moment. That is the thing about it that tends to be misunderstood. The idea that clarity arrives, and then the choice follows from it in a clean, linear, once and done sequence that resolves the situation into something that no longer requires tending. The clarity arrives, and then the choice must be made again tomorrow, and the day after. Not because the clarity was insufficient, or the choice was not genuinely made the first time, but because the dynamic does not resolve into stillness, simply because the person inside it has arrived at an honest picture of what it is. The avoidance love is still real tomorrow. The wanting is still present the day after. The not over quality of the interior reality does not expire because the person who loves them has made a clear-eyed decision about what the not enough means for their own continued investment. The feelings on both sides persist. The connection persists in some form in the interior of both people, regardless of what the behavior looks like from the outside. And the persistence of that interior reality means the choosing, the daily renewed conscious choosing of the clear-eyed position over the hope-colored one, is ongoing work rather than a completed act. This is one of the less acknowledged aspects of loving an avoidant and attempting to navigate the aftermath of the dynamic with genuine integrity. The choosing has to be sustained, not because the person making it is weak or insufficiently healed, but because the material they are working with, the genuine feeling, the real connection, the specific quality of what was present in a dynamic at its truest moments, is not material that simply loses its pull because an honest assessment has been made of its inadequacy. Genuine feeling persists past the assessment of its inadequacy. Genuine connection leaves an impression that does not dissolve because the behavior that surrounded it was insufficient to contain it. The daily renewal of the choice looks different from the original choice. The original choice tends to arrive with some emotional intensity, with the specific energy of clarity arriving after confusion, of the honest picture finally forming after the generous interpretations had been keeping it fragmented. There is something in that arrival that carries its own motivating quality, the relief of seeing clearly, the particular, grief-adjacent but ultimately liberating experience of finally knowing what is known rather than managing the not knowing. The daily renewal is quieter, less dramatic. It tends to arrive not as a significant interior event, but as the small, ordinary, unwitnessed choosing of the clear-eyed position in the specific moments when the not-over reality surfaces and the pull of the hope-colored interpretation makes itself available. It arrives in the moment of seeing something that reminds the person of the avoidant, and feeling the specific pull of the still-present connection, rather than the clean absence that would make the choosing unnecessary. It arrives in the moment of receiving a message or a peripheral signal from the avoidant and having to decide, again, how to receive it, with the accurate picture intact or with the hope-colored reading that the genuine feeling makes perpetually available. It arrives in the quiet moments when the honest body-level knowledge of what was real in the connection surfaces and creates the specific longing for the version of that reality that was always possible but never quite became consistent. In each of those moments, the choosing, not the suppression of the feeling is allowed to be real, is not required to disappear as a condition of the clear-eyed position. But the choosing of the accurate picture alongside the feeling, the maintenance of both things simultaneously, the real feeling and the honest assessment of what the real feeling is currently able to receive in return. There is something worth naming about what sustains the daily renewal of the choice. Because willpower alone does not sustain it, the effortful, white-knuckled maintenance of a clear-eyed position against the persistent pull of genuine feeling is not a sustainable strategy. It depletes. It requires the ongoing expenditure of resources against the grain of something that is not going away on its own timeline, simply because the assessment has been made. What sustains the daily renewal is not resistance. It is the deepening inhabitation of the life that the clear-eyed position makes possible. The filling of the space, not as a distraction strategy, not as the deliberate overwriting of the avoidant with other content, but as the genuine, increasingly absorbed engagement with the actual texture of the person's own life, their own interests, their own development, their own genuine connections with people who are present in the ordinary conditions and not requiring the sustained interpretive labor of the avoidant dynamic. The more genuinely inhabited the person's own life becomes, the more fully occupied by genuine engagement rather than by the management of the avoidant dynamic's emotional residue, the less the daily choosing requires effortful resistance. Not because the feeling for the avoidant has disappeared, but because the space that the avoidant occupied in the person's attention is being genuinely filled by the life that was always available and was always worth inhabiting. This is not the manufactured busyness of someone trying to think about something other than the avoidant. It is the genuine, increasingly organic return of attention to the things that are actually present and actually nourishing in the person's life. The difference between those two things is felt in the quality of the engagement. Manufactured busyness has the quality of distraction. It sits on top of the preoccupation rather than replacing it, and the preoccupation surfaces in every quiet moment when the distraction is insufficient. Genuine inhabitation has a different quality entirely. It does not require the suppression of the avoidance presence in the interior because it is genuinely absorbing in its own right. The genuine inhabitation tends to develop gradually rather than arriving all at once. There are phases to it. The early phase tends to be the most effortful, the phase where the avoidance presence in the interior is still acute, where the daily choosing is still requiring real effort, where the life being returned to is not yet fully inhabited enough to generate its own momentum. This phase is real, and it deserves patience rather than the expectation that the genuine inhabitation should arrive immediately, simply because the clear-eyed position has been chosen. The middle phase tends to be characterized by increasing intervals, longer stretches where the genuine inhabitation is the dominant experience, interrupted by shorter returns to the acute awareness of the avoidance presence in the interior. The choosing in this phase is still daily, but less effortful, less against the grain, more the natural expression of a person who is increasingly oriented toward their own genuine life. The later phase, which arrives on its own timeline, cannot be rushed and does not look the same for every person, is characterized by the genuine inhabitation becoming the baseline rather than the achievement. The avoidance presence in the interior is still real, but it is no longer the organizing principle of the emotional landscape. It exists as a part of the person's history of the real things that happened and genuinely mattered, without being the primary location of the person's ongoing attention and investment. In this later phase, something becomes available that the earlier phases could not access. A genuine, non-defensive, non-bitter perspective on the avoidant and on the dynamic and on what was real in it. Not the perspective of someone who has successfully suppressed the feeling enough to appear healed. Not the perspective of someone who has rewritten the history of the connection into something less than it was in order to make the not investing feel justified. But the perspective of someone who has genuinely integrated the experience, who can hold the real love and the real inadequacy, the real connection and the real insufficiency, the real not over and the real not enough, all without collapsing any of it into something simpler than it actually was. That perspective is genuinely free. Not free in the sense of having no feeling about the avoidant or the dynamic, free in the sense of not being organized around it, not structured by it, not requiring any particular outcome from it in order to function fully and genuinely in the present. From that perspective, the not over quality of the connection can be held without it being the reason to remain in insufficient conditions. The love that is still real in the avoidance interior can be acknowledged as real without it being the reason to structure the present around the hope of its eventual adequate expression. The genuine quality of what existed in the connection can be honored as genuinely real without the honoring requiring the continued investment in a dynamic that has not demonstrated the behavioral change that genuine adequate expression would require. This is the perspective from which the clearest reading of the avoidance current state becomes possible. Not the reading distorted by hope, not the reading that inflates every signal in the direction of imminent return and adequate showing up. Not the reading distorted by hurt, not the reading that dismisses every signal as insufficient regardless of what it actually indicates, but the honest, free, genuinely accurate reading of what the avoidance behavior is actually showing in the present conditions. And what the avoidance behavior is showing in the present conditions, in the actual ordinary days of whatever the dynamic looks like now, is either the evidence of genuine change or the evidence of the pattern intact, not the evidence of the interior feeling, which has been established as genuinely present regardless of the behavioral expression, but the evidence of the behavioral expression itself, of what is actually happening in the ordinary conditions, of whether the effort is present in the unremarkable days or concentrated in the motivated moments. That evidence speaks, it has always spoken, and from the free, integrated, genuinely inhabiting perspective of someone who has done their own work on themselves, the perspective that is no longer organized around the outcome of the avoidance process, the evidence speaks with a clarity that the hope-colored perception and the hurt-colored perception both obscure. What the evidence says determines everything about what comes next, not in the dramatic sense of determining a single significant decision that resolves the dynamic into one of two outcomes, but in the daily, ordinary texture of life sense of what the person who has genuinely inhabited themselves chooses to do with their ongoing attention and investment. If the evidence says the pattern is genuinely changing, if the ordinary days are showing the gradual, imperfect, authentic accumulation of a different quality of effort, if the texture is shifting in the direction of genuine mutual presence rather than managed distance, then the clear-eyed position does not require the maintenance of distance for its own sake. The clear-eyed position is simply seeing accurately, and if what it is seeing is genuine change, seeing it accurately means acknowledging the change rather than maintaining a skepticism that the evidence no longer supports. If the evidence says the pattern is intact, if the ordinary days are still showing the characteristic avoidant texture of conditional presence and managed warmth and effort concentrated in the heightened conditions, then the clear-eyed position continues to hold the accurate picture of what the dynamic is providing. Not with bitterness, not with the rigid maintenance of a predetermined conclusion, but with the honest, pattern-level assessment of what has consistently been true across sufficient time and sufficient ordinary conditions. The not over is real. Let it be real. The love is real. Let it be real. The genuine wanting, present in the avoidance interior, even in the silence and the distance, let that be real too. None of it needs to be dismissed or minimized or converted into something simpler in order for the clear-eyed position to be maintained. The clear-eyed position does not require the denial of any of those things. It requires their honest placement in the accurate picture alongside the things that are equally real, the not enough, the insufficient expression, the gap between the interior reality and the behavioral demonstration of it that has not yet been closed by the genuine work that closing it requires. All of it real, all of it held, without collapsing the complexity into either the hope-colored narrative or the hurt-colored one. Just the full picture, received honestly, with the free, integrated, genuinely self-inhabited perspective of someone who has done enough of their own work to see clearly, rather than hopefully or bitterly. From that seeing, from that full, honest, clear-eyed holding of everything that is true, whatever comes next will be the right thing, not the perfect thing. Not the thing guaranteed to produce a specific outcome, but the right thing for a person who has arrived at genuine clarity and is choosing from that clarity rather than from the confusion that the dynamic was always trying to maintain. The love is real, the wanting is real, the not over is real, and so is the life that is happening right now, in the present, in the genuine fullness of a self that has reclaimed itself completely. That life does not wait for the avoidance interior reality to become adequate behavior. It is already happening, it is already everything. The question is whether the person living it is fully present to it, or still partly elsewhere, in the silence, in the not over, in the genuine but insufficient love of someone whose interior has not yet found its way into the behavior that would make the love receivable. Come home to your life, fully. The love will do whatever it is going to do, on its own timeline, in its own conditions, without requiring your suspension as the price of its potential. Your life is happening now. Be in it, completely. That is where everything worth having actually lives. Coming home to the life that is happening now is not a single arrival. It is a practice that deepens over time, that has different qualities in different seasons, that requires different things from the person doing it at different points in the process of genuine reclamation. It is not the dramatic homecoming of someone who has been away and returns to find everything exactly as they left it. It is something quieter and more gradual than that. More like the slow return of color to something that had gone slightly gray during the period of the dynamic. Not a sudden restoration, but an incremental brightening that is most visible in retrospect, rather than in the moment of its happening. The person who has been in an avoidant dynamic for a significant period tends not to realize until they are genuinely returning to themselves how much of their interior life had been quietly organized around the dynamic without their full conscious awareness. How much of their attention, not the acute, front-of-mind attention that was obviously engaged with the question of the avoidance availability, but the background, ambient, always running attention that constitutes the majority of a person's interior activity, had been allocated to the ongoing management of the dynamic's emotional landscape. The monitoring, the interpreting, the low-level, perpetual scanning of signals for information about where things stood, what was coming, whether the warmth was going to hold or whether the distance was going to reassert itself. The background processing of interactions for what they meant, what they indicated, whether they were the beginning of something or the end of something, or simply the continuation of the same ambiguous middle that the dynamic seemed designed to inhabit indefinitely. All of that processing consumed interior resources in ways that were invisible during the dynamic because they had become the ambient condition of normal. Only in their absence, only as the genuine return to the self proceeds and the background processing gradually releases its claim on the person's interior, does the scale of the consumption become fully visible. The release of that consumption is one of the more significant experiences of the reclamation process. It does not arrive all at once. It arrives in increments, in the gradual noticing that there are stretches of the day where the avoidant has not been the background reference point for the interior, where the attention has been elsewhere, genuinely elsewhere, not effortfully redirected but organically occupied with something that is present and engaging in its own right. Where the question of where things stand with the avoidant simply has not been active for an hour or an afternoon or eventually a whole day. Those stretches are significant not because they indicate the feeling is gone. They do not indicate that. The feeling persists, but they indicate that the feeling is no longer the organizing principle of the interior, that it has found its appropriate place in the person's emotional landscape, present, real, no longer denied or suppressed, or converted into something other than what it is, but also no longer the center around which everything else is arranged. That finding of appropriate place is what integration looks like from the inside. Not the disappearance of the feeling, the finding of a place for it that does not require the entire interior to reorganize around it. The life that becomes accessible as the feeling finds its appropriate place is not a lesser life for the having loved and avoidant. That is one of the persistent and damaging myths about the aftermath of this kind of dynamic. The idea that the experience leaves a person diminished, more defended, less capable of the full, open, genuinely investing love that characterized the connection with the avoidant. That the damage done by the insufficient dynamic is damage to the capacity for love itself. It is not. The capacity for love is not what was damaged. What was affected, temporarily in ways that the genuine reclamation process reverses, was the relationship to the self, the quiet accumulated erosion of self-referencing that the dynamic produced through its characteristic demand for the constant outward direction of attention and energy. The gradual, almost imperceptible diminishment of the self as the primary subject of the person's own care and attention, as that care and attention was increasingly directed toward the management of the avoidance availability and the maintenance of a connection that required constant tending from one direction. What returns in the genuine reclamation is not the capacity for love, that was never gone. What returns is the self as the primary subject of the person's own attention. The restoration of the interior as a space that is tended first, that is attended to with the same quality of care and perceptive generosity that was being directed outward, that is treated as the primary location of what matters, rather than the secondary location from which resources are drawn to invest elsewhere. That restoration changes the quality of the love that becomes available for subsequent connections. Not the capacity was always full, but the quality, the way it moves, the direction it flows, the relationship between the giving and the receiving that characterizes it. Love that comes from a person who is genuinely inhabiting themselves, who has restored the self to its appropriate position as the primary subject of their own attention and care, has a different quality than love that comes from a person who has been organized around someone else's availability. It is not smaller, it is more complete. It includes the self in a way that the avoidant dynamic love did not. It is love that reaches toward the other person from a full place rather than from a place that is in the process of being gradually depleted by the one direction of investment. That fullness changes the dynamic of any connection it enters. Not because the person is now strategic about their investment, now managing their giving to ensure adequate return, but because the genuine fullness of someone who is actually inhabiting themselves has its own natural quality of self-referencing that does not require management. It is not managed reciprocity. It is the natural reciprocity of someone who knows what they feel and what they need and what they are and are not available for, and who brings that knowing into the connection as a matter of course rather than as a deliberate strategy. The avoidant dynamic, for all its cost, for all the genuine pain and confusion and specific damage it produced, also produced something that the person who went through it genuinely has that they might not have had otherwise, or might have had in less developed form. In less thoroughly tested and confirmed form, in the form of a quality that had not yet been put under the specific pressure that reveals whether a quality is genuine or merely potential. It produced the tested version of the self-knowledge, the version that was not simply claimed or aspired to, but actually confirmed under conditions that were genuinely challenging. The knowing of what genuine reciprocity feels like and what its simulation feels like, not as an intellectual distinction, but as a body-level, immediately recognizable difference. The knowing of what it costs to love without adequate return, and what it feels like to reclaim the self from that one-directional investment, and what the genuine fullness of a reclaimed interior is like as a condition of daily life. These are not small things to know. They are among the most practically valuable things a person can know in navigating subsequent intimate connections. Because they are not theoretical, they are earned. They had the specific, unchallengeable authority of genuine experience, rather than the more fragile authority of received wisdom that has not yet been tested against the actual conditions it claims to describe. The person who knows the difference between genuine presence and managed presence, who has lived inside a dynamic where the distinction was perpetually relevant, and has developed the specific perceptual sensitivity to feel the difference in the texture of ordinary interactions, carries that sensitivity into every subsequent space, and it functions as a genuinely protective perception, not protective in the defensive, wall-building sense, but protective in the discerning sense, in the sense of being able to feel with a precision that the pre-dynamic self may not have had, when something is the real thing and when something is its compelling but insufficient approximation. That perception is an asset. It will not prevent the occasional misreading. No perceptual tool is infallible. But it will tend to produce a much faster and more accurate recognition of the characteristic signatures of avoidant dynamics in their early stages, before the investment has deepened to the level where the recognition is costly to act on. The specific texture of managed warmth, the particular quality of conditional presence, the early signs of effort that is concentrated in the motivated moments rather than sustained across the ordinary days. These are recognizable now, in a way they perhaps were not before, because they were lived with, at close range, for long enough to become known in the body rather than only in the mind. The not-over quality of the connection with the avoidant does not contradict any of this, does not require the person who has reclaimed themselves to pretend it is over when it is not, or to perform a closure they do not genuinely feel, or to convert the real feeling into something lesser, in order to justify the forward motion of a life that is not waiting for the avoidance interior to become adequate behavior. The not over can simply be what it is, the accurate, honest, non-narrative acknowledgement of an interior reality that has not yet concluded. A real connection that is suspended in the specific, unresolved territory of genuine feeling without adequate expression. A love that is real on both sides and insufficient in its current form on one side. All of it true, all of it held. Without urgency, without the requirement that it resolve into something clear and final, before the person who loves the avoidant is permitted to fully inhabit their own life. The not over is a fact about the interior, not a directive about the behavior, not an instruction to wait, not a reason to structure the present around the hope of the future resolution. Simply a fact. The connection has not fully concluded in the interior of either person. That is true. And the person's life continues in full, inhabits itself genuinely, moves forward with complete presence in the actual texture of the actual days, regardless of the fact that something remains unresolved in a space that only the avoidant's genuine choosing can eventually resolve. The avoidant's love is real. Their wanting is real. The not-over quality of the connection is real. And the person who loves them is living their life fully, genuinely, in the complete inhabitation of the present, with the clear-eyed understanding that real love in an interior that has not yet developed the capacity to express it adequately is not a foundation, is not a reason to wait, is not sufficient, is real and insufficient, both, simultaneously, without apology for the complexity. What would change that equation? What would shift the not over from the suspended, unresolved interior reality it currently is into something that could become an actual, present, mutually inhabited connection, is known, has been said, is not a mystery requiring further analysis. The work. The genuine, sustained, behaviorally demonstrable interior work that closes the gap between the real feeling and the adequate expression of it. That changes the ordinary days. That makes the effort present in the unremarkable hours rather than the heightened ones. That turns the love from something that lives in the avoidance interior into something the person who loves them can actually receive. If that work happens, if it genuinely, demonstrably over sufficient time in the ordinary conditions happens, then the not over will have somewhere to go, a direction, a possible becoming, something that the real feeling on both sides and the genuine quality of what the connection has always had the potential to be can finally, actually, in the lived rather than the hoped-for reality, move toward. Until then, the life, the full, genuine, completely inhabited, genuinely forward-moving life of someone who has done their own work, reclaimed their own interior, and is no longer organizing their days around the resolution of someone else's unfinished interior process. That life is not the consolation prize. It is not the what you do while you wait. It is the actual thing, the real, present, genuinely yours thing, that was always worth inhabiting with complete presence. The avoidance love is real, and it lives in their silence. Your life is real and it lives in your days. Be in your days, all the way in, without holding a portion of yourself in reserve for a resolution that is not yours to determine. That reservation costs you something real every day it is maintained. And what it costs you is the one thing you cannot afford to keep spending on someone else's unfinished work. Your own complete, unreserved, fully present inhabitation of the only life that is actually yours. Be here, fully, now. That is not giving up on the love. That is honoring it, by refusing to let its insufficiency diminish the life that deserves to be lived in full.